A poor widow begged, "Please save my baby." The rancher looked at her baby and said, "Then stay." She clutched her baby to her chest, little Jamie, limp with fever, bundled in all the warmth she could spare. Her boots were soaked, her fingers numb inside torn gloves, and every breath tasted of blood and ice. She had not seen a soul in 2 days, not since the trail forked and the wind picked up. Her husband's grave lay far behind, somewhere in the frozen Missouri soil. She had whispered her goodbye with shaking lips and had not spoken since, until now. "Stay with me, Jamie," she murmured, pressing her cracked lips to the child's damp forehead. "Please, baby, stay with me." The snow was past her knees when she saw it, a slanted rooftop jutting from the white like a half-sunken ship. A barn stood beyond, warped and splintered. One corner collapsed completely. The house itself was 2 stories of sagging timber, its shutters torn, its front door hanging crooked on one hinge. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. A miracle. Sandra staggered up the last few yards, legs nearly giving beneath her. She pounded once, then again on the warped wooden door. Wind screamed past her ears. No answer. She looked down at Jamie. His eyes fluttered beneath heavy lids. She knocked again, harder this time. A scraping sound. Then the door creaked open just a hand's width, and a pair of eyes peered out, pale, sharp, shadowed by exhaustion and suspicion. The barrel of a rifle filled the gap just below them. Sandra didn't flinch. "Please," she choked out, barely louder than the wind. "My boy, he's burning up. We've been walking all day." There's nowhere else." The man behind the door said nothing at first. His face was unshaven, hard-lined. He looked past her, as if expecting someone else to rise from the snow behind her. When he saw none, his gaze dropped to the baby in her arms. Jamie let out a soft, strangled cry. The man's jaw twitched. "I ain't got food for 2, let alone 3, he said. "I'm not asking for food," Sandra swallowed. "Just shelter, a floor, anything dry. Just until the storm passes." He exhaled through his nose. The wind shrieked through the trees behind her. "You got a name?" he asked finally. "Sandra," she said. "Sandra Harper. The boy's Jamie. Sandra." Another long pause. Then the door creaked open wider. He lowered the rifle. "I'm Callum Hayes," he muttered. "And this place ain't much. Roof leaks. Woods near gone. No doctor. No heat but what I can split." Sandra nodded, teeth chattering. "I don't care." Callum looked at the child again, at the sweat on his face, despite the cold. "I got nothing to offer," he said, voice low. "Nothing but a roof that moans in the wind, and some damp firewood." He stepped aside. "But if you can live with that, then stay." Sandra didn't thank him. Not with words. She stepped over the threshold with the last of her strength and collapsed just inside, shielding Jamie as she hit the floor. The door closed behind them with a thud, cutting out the wind. The storm raged on outside, but inside it was the sound of kindling, crackling to life, that filled the silence. Callum fed damp wood into the hearth, jaw tight, eyes darting once toward the girl curled up on his floor. And then, he said nothing more. Not yet. The days that followed were slow and quiet. The snow outside thickened again, locking the cabin deeper into silence, but inside, a strange rhythm began to settle. Sandra moved carefully through Callum's world, never asking questions, never touching more than she needed. She cooked what little he had, potatoes, dried beans, a strip of salted pork she found hanging in the shed. She boiled water to clean Jamie's blankets. She swept the hearth twice a day, though it hardly mattered in the drafty room. Callum didn't speak much. He tended to chores in short bursts, splitting wood, fixing the shutter that banged in the wind. His limp slowed him, but he never complained. It was the attic that drew Sandra. She found it 2 days after arriving, up a narrow stairway tucked behind the pantry. Jamie had just fallen asleep, and she was looking for extra cloth. The door stuck, swollen with age, but gave way with a hard push. The room smelled of soot and dust. Its ceiling sloped low under the roofline. A single window, iced over and cracked, let in a sliver of light. Near the far wall she saw it. Charred wood. The dark stain of fire, long, cold, but never cleaned. The outline of a cradle sat half buried in the ash, one side splintered inward as if crushed by something falling from above. A scrap of cloth still clung to its frame, once white, now the color of old smoke. Sandra didn't touch it. She stood there for a long time, her breath white in the cold air. Then she stepped back, closed the attic door quietly, and returned to the fire. That night, Callum stirred in his sleep. Sandra sat across the room, rocking Jamie gently, half drowsing. At first, she thought Callum was talking to her. "Anna," he murmured, "where's the boy?" His face twisted in sleep, caught in something he could not escape. "Take him, just take him, please." Sandra clutched Jamie tighter. When morning came, she made strong coffee and poured Callum a cup. He looked at her, bleary-eyed, and took it without a word. "You talk in your sleep," she said after a while. He didn't answer at first. "Yeah," he said finally. "Anna was your wife?" Callum nodded, staring at the steam curling from his cup. "And the boy?" Another pause, then a slow, hard breath. "Lucas. He was 5. Sandra waited. Callum set the cup down and leaned back in the chair. "It was cold that week. Like this. I rode into town for supplies, left the fire going low, thought they'd be warm enough till I got back." His jaw tightened. Chimney caught. House lit up like a torch. Sandra said nothing. She couldn't. "I buried them myself," he added, "up behind the barn." "I'm sorry," she whispered. He didn't nod, didn't thank her, just looked past her at the fire. Later that day, after Jamie was fed and sleeping, Sandra climbed back into the attic. She brought rags and warm water in a basin, a broom, and a clean cloth. She didn't tell Callum. She didn't need to. She began by scrubbing the walls, brushing soot from the beams, picking up splinters and setting aside the broken cradle with careful hands. Over the next days she returned again and again, each time doing more, clearing ash, patching cloth, rethreading old curtains, sewing a new quilt from scraps of flannel. She never spoke of it, and neither did he. But on the 4th day, Callum came in from the cold and paused at the bottom of the attic stairs. He didn't climb them. He just stood there for a long time, hand resting on the rail. Then he turned back to the fire, where Jamie lay on a blanket kicking his feet, and for the first time in weeks, Callum smiled. Just a little, just enough. The snow had crusted hard after days of thaw and freeze, glinting like glass beneath the pale morning sun. Sandra was outside early, hanging damp linens on a sagging clothesline strung between 2 warped posts. Jamie played on a blanket near the porch, bundled in layers and happily chewing on a wooden spoon. She heard the horse before she saw it. A single rider approached from the south, trotting briskly along the ridgeline. The man wore a long, black wool coat, clean boots, and a brimmed hat pulled low. He carried himself like someone who didn't need to explain himself twice. Callum stepped out from the barn, wiping grease from his fingers. His face tightened the moment he spotted the rider. "Mr. Hayes," the man called as he slowed his horse near the front of the cabin. "Name's Ellis. I'm with the First Bank of Laramie." Callum didn't move. "We've written to you 3 times, Ellis continued, dismounting. "No payments since June. No response. That puts us well past the grace period." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folder of papers, sealed with the bank's insignia. Callum's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. "The property, per contract, is subject to seizure unless you can make good on your debt before the month's end." Sandra, watching from the porch, stepped forward before she even knew why. "Excuse me," she said. Ellis blinked at her. "And you are?" "I'm Mrs. Hayes," she said evenly. "Callum's wife." Callum's head turned sharply, but he didn't say a word. Sandra continued, her voice calm. "He has been ill this winter. We've had a sick child, as well. We're only now beginning to find our footing again. We ask for time, 30 days. Ellis narrowed his eyes, assessing her. "There's no record of a marriage." "We were married privately in Missouri," she said. "No formal announcement." Jamie babbled behind her, as if echoing the lie. Ellis looked between her and Callum, skeptical. "You understand," he said slowly, "that if this is a false statement, it qualifies as fraud." "It isn't," Sandra said. "I keep the house, I tend the fire, I bear his name." There was steel in her voice, soft but unmistakable. Ellis stared at her for another long moment, then turned back to Callum. "Well?" Callum's mouth opened, closed, then finally, "It's true." A pause. Ellis exhaled sharply, slid the papers back into his bag. "Fine, 1 month. But that's the last rope you're getting." He mounted up again, gave Callum a curt nod, and rode off without another word. Sandra stood still on the porch, her heart thudding in her chest. She hadn't meant to say it. It had just come out, simple, clean, necessary. Callum walked up the steps slowly. His limp was worse today. He looked at her for a long time before speaking. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she replied. "You lied." "I know that too." "Why?" Sandra looked at Jamie, now giggling in the morning light, then back at Callum. "Because you saved my son when no one else would. Because this place," she hesitated, "it matters to you. And because I could do one thing, for once, that might help." He looked at her, long and searching. Not angry, not quite grateful, just moved. "You could have walked away," he said quietly. "I still might," she said, just as softly, "but not today." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Callum turned, limped back toward the barn. Sandra gathered the linens from the line. Jamie laughed at the breeze, and the lie between them hung in the air, not sharp like a wound, but soft like a thread newly spun, not yet broken. The wind returned without mercy. By nightfall, it clawed at the shutters like an animal. The old wood groaned in protest. Snow beat against the cabin walls in great heaving waves, each gust louder than the last. Inside, the fire sputtered low, refusing to catch no matter how many times Sandra fed it with kindling. Callum was asleep in the corner, wrapped in his coat, his legs still stiff from the collapse 2 weeks prior. Sandra sat upright on a stool by the hearth, Jamie in her arms, both bundled in the last of the dry quilts. The temperature inside the room dropped sharply. She could see her breath again, drifting like smoke in the dim light. The last log in the fire popped once, then crumbled into embers. Jamie stirred. At first it was just a twitch, his fingers tightening in the folds of her shawl. Then his lips parted in a soft, sharp whimper. Sandra pressed his face into her neck, trying to warm him with her own skin. "It's all right, baby," she whispered. "Mama's here, I've got you." But his little body had begun to tremble. His breaths came fast and shallow, his feet like ice. She stood, rushed to the woodpile, grabbed another log, damp. It hissed uselessly in the coals. She tried again. Nothing caught. Behind her, the blankets rustled. Callum was awake now, watching. "I can't get it going," she said, not bothering to hide the panic in her voice. "He's so cold. I don't—" "He's shaking, Callum. I don't know what to do." Callum sat up slowly. His gaze moved from her face to the child in her arms. Without a word, he reached down and pulled his sweater over his head. "What are you—" "I've got one trick left," he said simply, already crossing the room. Sandra stepped back instinctively, still clutching Jamie. "Give him to me. Callum. I'm not going to let him freeze." He said it so plainly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Sandra hesitated. Then, slowly, she handed Jamie over. Callum dropped to his knees by the hearth. He tugged his undershirt aside, exposing his bare chest, and gently nestled the baby against his skin. Jamie whimpered, too weak to protest. Callum wrapped both arms around the child, then pulled the heavy wool sweater back over the two of them. He sat back, cross-legged, cradling the boy close like a second heartbeat. Sandra stared. She had seen men weep at funerals, seen them fall off horses drunk and laugh at their own broken bones, but she had never seen a man offer his bare skin in silence, just to keep a child breathing. Jamie let out a soft, wet sigh. His little hand clutched at Callum's collarbone. Callum looked down, whispered, "There you go, little man. Just breathe." His voice cracked on the last word. Sandra sank to the floor beside them, her arms still empty, her chest aching. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You don't even know him." Callum glanced up. "I know what it's like to lose a boy." And that was it. Sandra put her hand to her mouth. The tears came hot and fast, uninvited but unstoppable. It was not fear that made her cry, not grief. It was something deeper, something old and raw and human. Gratitude. A kind of love that did not need permission to exist. She reached out and laid her hand gently on Callum's shoulder. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. They sat together like that, three people pressed close, while the fire slept and the storm raged. There was no glory in it, no heroism, just warmth, and for one long frozen night it was enough. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold remained. Morning sun spilled over the white fields, lighting the world in a still, frozen hush. Callum stood at the edge of the old cattle shed, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand. The roof had half caved during the last storm, and much of the back wall was leaning inward, its bricks worn smooth with time and neglect. "It will not hold much longer," Sandra said behind him, holding Jamie on her hip. "I ain't trying to make it pretty," Callum muttered, "just trying to keep the wind out." He paused, then looked back at her. "If I can get that east wall shored up, this place'll make a decent shelter for your boy, warmer than the house come nightfall." Sandra wanted to say something, anything to stop him. But he had that look again, the one he wore when chopping wood or fixing the broken stovepipe. Like if he just kept fixing things, maybe the past would stay buried. So she nodded and stepped back. Callum braced a beam against the inside of the eastern wall. The brick above groaned. He placed a new board at the base, driving a nail with 3 steady swings. The 4th nail never came. The sound was deafening. Crack, groan, crash. The upper portion of the wall gave way, bricks cascading like a red wave. Sandra screamed. Jamie began to cry. When the dust settled, Callum lay half-buried beneath a pile of debris, one leg twisted at a sickening angle, blood soaking through his sleeve from where a beam had caught his shoulder. "Callum!" she cried, racing to his side. She set Jamie down safely and began pulling bricks away with both hands, her breath frantic. His eyes were closed, his chest moved, but barely. "Callum, stay with me. Do not you dare." He coughed once, sharp and wet. Then his eyes opened, hazy. "Should have used the shorter beam," he rasped. "Damn thing always bowed inward." She wanted to laugh and sob at the same time. "Save your strength, fool," she muttered, blinking tears away. She wrapped his shoulder tightly with torn cloth, braced his leg with a fallen plank, and dragged him inside with every ounce of strength she had. It took nearly half an hour. By the end, she was shaking. That night, Callum drifted in and out of fevered sleep. He murmured things, half prayers, half names. "Anna, where's the boy?" Sandra sat beside him, dabbing sweat from his brow. When he finally stilled, she moved through the cabin in search of more clean bandages. The upstairs storage closet was empty, so she tried the root cellar below the kitchen. It was colder there. Still. The smell of earth and mold clung to the stone walls. She pulled up a loose plank to check a barrel, and noticed something buried beneath the dirt. A small wooden box. She hesitated, then lifted it. Inside, folded papers, yellowed with age. A locket. A child's drawing. And beneath it all, a letter, unfinished. Ink smeared. "My darling Callum," it read, "if you find this, I hope it means you are still alive." Jamie wouldn't stop crying today. He kept asking when Papa would be home. I didn't have the heart to tell him. The writing trailed off there. The ink faded, interrupted by what looked like water. No, maybe tears. Sandra's breath caught. Jamie. She stared at the name on the page, then at her own Jamie sleeping upstairs. She felt a sudden weight in her chest, something not quite pain, not quite jealousy. She closed the box gently, returned it exactly where she found it. The next morning she moved quietly. She fed Jamie. She tended the fire. She boiled water for compresses. But she did not meet Callum's eyes when he woke. She did not speak unless spoken to. And when he called her name, soft, questioning, she answered only with, "Rest, you need it." Because now she knew. There had been another Jamie, another cradle, another woman who once waited for this man to come home. And though Sandra owed him everything, she could not shake the feeling that in this house she had borrowed a place that did not truly belong to her. The days that followed passed in silence. Callum's wounds began to heal, though he still limped badly, and his shoulder ached when the wind blew. Sandra tended him carefully but distantly, her hands gentle but her voice restrained. She no longer asked about the weather. She did not linger in the attic or by the hearth after Jamie was asleep. And though she still made his meals, stacked firewood by the stove, and mended his shirts, she did so with a careful, deliberate space between them. Callum noticed. Of course he did. One evening, after Jamie had drifted off in his cradle, Callum stood awkwardly at the doorway to the kitchen, watching her stir a pot of stew. "You've been quiet," he said. Sandra didn't look up. "I have been thinking. About what?" She hesitated. "About what comes next." There it was, that pull in his chest, the one he tried not to name. The same feeling that had crept up in him each time she reached for Jamie with a tenderness he remembered from long ago. The same feeling that swelled when she laughed, rare, fleeting but honest. He had let himself hope. "Are you planning to leave?" he asked finally. Sandra stirred the stew, slow and steady. "I do not know." That night, long after the house had gone quiet, she stood alone by the window. Outside, snowflakes fell like whispers, soft and slow. She pressed a hand to the glass, then to her chest. She had tried so hard to remain grateful, to frame everything through the lens of survival, of necessity, of debt repaid. But it was no longer gratitude she felt. It was something warmer, deeper, terrifying. Sandra Harper was falling in love. Not with a savior, but with a man who limped when he walked, who swore under his breath when wood refused to split, who still woke at night crying out for ghosts. A man who gave everything even when he had nothing. And to love again, after everything, felt like betrayal. That night, after Jamie was fed and asleep, she sat down at the small table by the hearth and wrote. The note was short, plain, folded once, and left by the cradle. "Callum, you have given me more than shelter, more than kindness, more than I could ever return. But I am not ready to give my heart again. My husband is still buried in me, in the quiet places. I hear him when I close my eyes. I feel him when the wind shifts, and I fear that if I let him go, I will lose what little of myself I have left. You saved my son. That is something I will carry with me always. Please forgive me for slipping away. Sandra." She packed what little she had, 2 changes of clothes, a half loaf of bread, a small tin of tea. She bundled extra food for Jamie and left it beside his cradle. Fresh milk, boiled oats, clean cloths, a jar of honey. Then she stood in the doorway, looking back one last time. The fire crackled softly. Jamie shifted in his sleep. And Callum, he lay on the cot near the stove, hand resting beside the rifle he no longer loaded. His face in sleep was softer than she had ever seen it. Sandra pressed her lips to Jamie's forehead. Then, silently, she stepped out into the cold. The door closed behind her with a click. Not a slam, not a farewell, just final. When Callum woke the next morning, the cabin was warm. The fire was still alive. The table was set for 2. But the cradle was empty. The door was unlocked. And the world beyond was wide and white and silent. He saw the note, read it once. then sat down in the chair she had left pulled out, like a breath half held. The pain in his shoulder flared, but it was not what made him close his eyes. The cold returned with the dawn. Callum saddled the horse before the frost had finished settling, fingers aching as he tightened the cinch strap. Jamie was wrapped in every blanket Sandra had left behind, tucked against his chest in a sling made from an old bedsheet. The baby stirred once, let out a soft sigh, and fell back into sleep. There was only one place she could have gone. The nearest town was 2 days south. No woman would make it far in that snow without stopping. Callum set off west, toward the old postal station, where travelers sometimes waited for a stagecoach that rarely came. It took half the day to get there. By the time the small wooden outpost came into view, more shack than station, his muscles burned and his leg throbbed where the bricks had struck weeks before. He tied the horse to a post, adjusted Jamie in his arms, and stepped inside. The smell of smoke and wet wool filled the air. A fire crackled in the hearth. A man behind the counter dozed with a hat over his face. And near the wall, hunched over the fire with her back to him, sat Sandra. Her shoulders were drawn tight. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of something warm. But it was the way she sat, tilted forward, chin nearly on her chest, that told Callum everything. She was not waiting for a coach. She was not reading. She was just sitting. Lost. He crossed the room slowly. Jamie stirred, whimpered, then blinked awake. The small sound made Sandra turn her head. Her eyes locked on his, then on the baby. Her breath caught. "Jamie," she whispered. The boy reached out a tiny hand. Sandra stood too fast, knocking over the cup in her lap. It clattered to the floor, spilling lukewarm tea across the worn planks. She did not notice. Callum stopped a few feet from her. "Why didn't you go farther?" he asked, voice quiet. Sandra's eyes were wide, glassy, brimming with something between guilt and awe. "Because no one else ever gave me a home," she said. Her voice trembled. "Not when I had money. Not when I had love. Not when I lost everything." She stepped forward, hand hovering near Jamie's cheek. "And you gave me shelter when you had nothing left to give." She looked up at him now, her voice breaking. "You gave me a roof full of holes, and cold hands, and silence, but it was real. It was more than anything I've ever known." He was not. Callum did not speak. He simply shifted Jamie into her arms and watched as her face lit up, color returning to her cheeks like dawn. Sandra held the baby close, inhaling the scent of his hair. Her lips trembled. "I missed one night," she said, "and it felt like years." Callum stepped closer. "You left a warm fire," he said. "Food, milk, cloths. I thought maybe you meant it just as a goodbye." Sandra looked up. "I thought I did." They stood in silence, inches apart. Then, without a word, he reached out and touched her cheek. It was not a kiss, not yet. Just a hand, rough, calloused, resting against skin that had not known peace in a long time. She closed her eyes. When they embraced, it was not out of sorrow, but recognition. Not because they were broken, but because they had survived the same storm and found each other in its quiet aftermath. Later, as they rode back through the snow-covered valley, Sandra kept one arm around Jamie and the other around Callum's waist. This time, when the wind blew, she leaned in. And when the house came into view, slumped and battered as ever, she smiled. Because she was no longer returning out of gratitude. She was coming home. A month passed. The snow still lay thick across the valley, but the skies had softened. Pale sunlight broke through the clouds more often now, casting silver light across the hills. The air still bit, but it no longer punished. From the roof came the sound of steady hammering. Callum stood balanced on the sloped shingles, coat slung over one beam, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His breath misted as he worked, but he hummed a quiet tune. Something old, half-remembered from childhood, maybe a lullaby. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the cabin. Sandra stood on a small stool by the front window, pinning up the last of the new curtains, soft cream cloth, stitched with tiny snowflake patterns. She stepped back to admire her work, wiping her hands on her apron. Behind her, the hearth crackled warmly. Jamie sat nearby on a quilted rug, banging a wooden spoon against a tin pot. The cradle stood in the corner, fully repaired. Sandra had lined it with soft wool, stuffed with dried lavender and cinnamon bark. It smelled like comfort, like home. A moment later, the front door creaked open. Cold air swept in with Callum as he stepped inside, boots heavy with snow. He stomped them by the door, setting his toolbox down, then paused when he saw Jamie crawling toward him. "Da-da," the boy said, clumsily but clear. Callum froze. Jamie grinned and reached for him, waving the spoon. Sandra turned from the window, eyes already shining. Callum bent slowly, scooping Jamie up into his arms. "Da-da," Jamie said again, gurgling with delight. Callum looked over the boy's head to Sandra. She wiped at her cheek, then smiled. "He did not get it wrong," she said softly. "You saved him, you saved me." Callum looked down at Jamie, his voice quiet. "First time in a long while," he said. "I wake up knowing why." Later that evening, after Jamie had been fed and tucked into the cradle, Callum walked across the room and knelt by the hearth. From beneath the floorboards, he drew out the small wooden box. He opened it one last time. Sandra sat nearby, saying nothing. Inside the box, the old letter still waited, unfinished, edges curled with time. Callum unfolded it, ran a finger over the familiar handwriting, then reached for the flames. The fire caught fast. The letter curled, turned black, and disappeared into orange light. Sandra rose and walked to him. She laid a hand on his shoulder, not to stop him, not to ask questions, just to be there. No words were needed. Later, they sat together at the table. Dinner was modest, vegetable stew, bread crisped over the fire, and weak coffee, but the warmth in the room made it a feast. Jamie dozed in Sandra's lap. Callum whittled at a piece of pine, shaping it carefully. With a few final strokes of the blade, he held up a small horse, rough but strong. "For Jamie," he said. Sandra took it from his hands, holding it like something precious. Outside, snow began to fall again, gently this time. Inside, the only sounds were the soft breath of a child asleep and the whisper of wood against wood. That winter was longer than most, but inside the cabin, a different kind of season began, one stitched from silence, from healing, from warmth found in the least likely place. And for the first time in years, no one thought of leaving. Sometimes, love does not ride in on horseback or roar through with gunfire. Sometimes, it comes quietly, through a leaky roof, a patched blanket, a name spoken for the first time. In the heart of winter, two souls found something worth staying for. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of love that lasts. If this story touched something in you, don't forget to tap that like button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of heartbreak, healing, and hope on the American frontier. There's more coming, more letters left unsent, more glances across campfires, more outlaws who fell in love when they weren't supposed to. Until next time, ride safe and love fierce.